Hello and welcome. I'm Dave. Today we're going to learn how easy it is to add authentication to your Next.js app with NextAuth. And I'll provide links to all resources in the description below. I'll also provide a link for you to join my Discord server where you can discuss web development with other students, and you can ask questions that I can answer and receive help from other viewers too. I look forward to seeing you there. I'm ready for a highly requested tutorial about NextAuth with the new Next.js app router, but first I'm happy to introduce CodiumAI as the sponsor for this video. CodiumAI analyzes your code and generates meaningful tests to catch bugs before you ship to production, or even before you have a code review with your boss or mentor. With CodiumAI, you can easily and quickly create comprehensive test suites that help ensure the reliability and correctness of your code. And CodiumAI currently supports JavaScript, TypeScript, and Python in VS Code and several other popular IDEs. Let's look at how it works. Just click the Generate Test button above any function, and CodiumAI will begin generating tests for your code. Review the tests created and even add your own custom tests. Also, check out the code analysis and code suggestions. I love these features. And when you're happy with the tests, save the test suite to a file. I'm going to provide links to their VS Code extension and main website below. Hey guys, adding CodiumAI to your VS Code is as easy as going to Extensions, searching for CodiumAI, and then installing it. It's free. Add it to your VS Code extensions today. Okay, let's get started. I've already created a new Next.js project, and I've said yes to all of the questions as the project was created. Now, looking at the package JSON, if you're completing this tutorial in the future, you should note that I'm using Next version 13.4.7. It's current as of today, and if you want Next to behave the way it does here in the tutorial, you may want to install this version. But I'm just letting you know that you could try to use the latest as well. So after that, we need to go ahead and install NextAuth. So let's open up a terminal window once again, type npm I and then next-auth, and we'll install the NextAuth package. We're back at the NextAuth website, and I'm looking at the introduction. They really have great docs, and you can explore these because NextAuth is very customizable. We're going to go over some of the basic settings for a quick implementation today, and that will get you started. And of course, I could cover other customizable settings in future tutorials as well. So let's look at some of the introduction here on NextAuth. And I want to highlight just a few things. We've got support for JSON Web Tokens and database sessions, and this is designed for serverless. Next.js does run on serverless, but it can also run anywhere. So NextAuth can work with AWS Lambda, Docker, Heroku, etc. It also says own your own data here, and I just want to highlight that it says it can also be used without a database, and that's what we're going to do today. We're going to use the default settings for JWT, but we're also going to set up OAuth for a GitHub login. Now let's go to the Getting Started link over here in the left-hand menu. And on Getting Started, we're going to scroll down just a little bit, and we can already see the install for NextAuth, and we've already done that. Then it says add an API route. But notice a lot of the examples here in the docs, at least currently as I'm making this video, show the old version here with pages/API/auth. But then you need to read some of the documentation as well, because it says if you're using Next.js 13.2 or above, it does support the new app router, and you can initialize the configuration using the new route handlers by following our guide. So let's just go ahead and click that guide and look at the setup here for a route handler. You can see this has a different path. Now it's in the app directory as we're provided in Next.js 13.2 and above. Then we create an API directory inside, then an auth directory, and then this catch-all route here inside of brackets with the 3 dots that says NextAuth, and then route TS. So let's go to Visual Studio Code now and do that. Back in VS Code, we need to open up the source directory if you added the source directory to your project. If not, you just have the app directory on that level, and that's where you need to create the next directory or folder, if you will, inside, and it's called API. And then inside of that one, we need to create another directory, and this is going to be called auth. And then finally, inside of auth, we need to create that catch-all that has a bracket, 3 dots, and then NextAuth, and another bracket. Now, inside of this directory is where we create the route.ts file. We'll start by importing NextAuth, and that's going to come from next-auth. After that, we're going to import options here in just a moment, but I won't do that yet. Let's define our handler, and we're going to set this equal to NextAuth. And this is where NextAuth will receive the options. So it's going to have a red squiggly until we pass in our options object. But after this, we just simply need to export, and we'll say handler as get, comma, and also handler as host. So our route.ts file is not too big, and you will see some go ahead and define their options object inside of this file. But I prefer to create a separate file, so let's go ahead and do that, and we'll just call this options.ts. We're back in the NextAuth documentation. We're under options now in the left-hand menu. And looking under options, the main thing we need to provide inside of our options object is the providers themselves, what we plan on using. So this is where we will say a GitHub provider that we're going to use with OAuth. We're also going to have a credentials provider, and we'll learn how to set that up. But there are some other settings they cover on this page. So let me scroll down just a little bit. It talks about a secret here. We're going to need to set a nextauth_secret as an environment variable. So we're going to create a .env.local file in our Next.js project for that. And then there's some other settings they cover as well. Oh, and we're going to use this, by the way, to go ahead and create that random secret. We can do that easily with this command in the terminal. Okay, underneath that, a few other settings that we can look at, although we're just going to use the default today, so we will not need to provide these, but I just want to draw your attention to them. You can set some settings for a session here, and this is where I wanted to really highlight this, because note, the default is a JWT that's encrypted, so it's referred to as a JWE. So if you've watched any of my previous React Auth videos in the past where we use JWT, this is a little different strategy, but I really like what they're doing. And really, rather than rolling your own, which creating your own like we did in that React Auth series is a great way to learn about auth, but this has a little more full-featuredness to it, and I really like how it's set up. So I recommend this strategy, actually, and you would use this encrypted JWE that's stored inside of a session cookie. So that's how they're doing this by default. And then you could use a database instead, but that's not what we'll be doing. We will just be using the JWT that is, once again, the default. So just highlighting that. Okay, let's scroll down just a little bit more. And then there's also a JWT setting. Once again, we won't need to do any of this because we're using the default and we're not using a database. And then they've got some other settings for the JWT, but the other one I want to find is pages. So notice this pages is a property here inside of that options object, and then it has its own object here. You can set up custom pages, but if not, these will be created for you. They'll just be found at a specific address that NextAuth provides. So if you wanted to create a custom sign-in page, then you could have it at, say, just /signin instead of the default, which might be auth/signin or auth/signout, and so on. Ours, because of this new router or route handler set up inside of the API/auth directory, everything that's created by default will actually be inside of /API/auth, and then we would have our sign in and sign out. But NextAuth creates these for us, and so just by using the defaults, we can implement this NextAuth quickly. Okay, let's go back to the code and set up our options object and our NextAuth secret as well. Let's start with import type, and then we need NextAuth options, and this is also going to come from next-auth. After we've imported our type, we will import our providers when we're ready for those. But let's first just set up the object. So I'll say export const options, and we'll set this, of course, the type being our NextAuth options. We'll set this to an object then that has a providers, and this providers is an array. So this is where we will put our providers that we decide to import and use in our application. Now, after this is where we would put, for example, the pages object that we looked at. So if we had a specific sign in, then we could give the path for that. Say you might want to move it to just sign in, but then you would have to create your own sign in page. and NextAuth will create one for you. So we're not going to provide this here. The same for the session. You would set a session and then set the related properties for that session that we looked at inside of the documentation. But now we're just going to focus on the providers. But before we go back to the docs and look at each individual provider, let's go ahead and open up a terminal. So Control and the backtick. And now inside of the terminal, let's type that command that will just generate that random secret for us. So it's open SSL rand and then dash base 64 and then the number 32. We'll press enter. And there is our random secret that we have. So we can just highlight and copy this with Control C. And now we need to go ahead and create a .env.local file in our next project. And we want this on the same level as the package.json file. So now let's create this file, and it's .env.local. By default, this would be listed inside of your git ignore file. You never want to send your environment variables to GitHub. So these are secrets. You keep them in your dev environment in the .env.local, and then when you deploy your application, you set the environment variables in your host, whether that's Vercel or somewhere else that you would deploy your Next.js application. So this is a next-auth_secret. And we'll set it equal to and just paste in that value with Control V is what I use to paste. And now we have in that random value. You will have a different value here. And of course, I'll delete these secrets in the future and won't be using those online. So no luck using mine. Just go ahead and generate your own. You will not find this .env.local file in the source code for this video because, as I said, you do not share this file in your GitHub. Back in the documentation, we're under configuration, providers, and then credentials. This is where we would sign in with a username and a password. And this is showing us how to set up the credentials provider that we would need to import at the top here. And it has some explanations, but I'll of course walk you through this as we create it in our project as well. And then another type of provider is OAuth. Now, OAuth can be GitHub, Twitter, Google, Facebook, any of these providers that provide an OAuth sign-in. And you've probably seen this before where you can just click sign in with GitHub or sign in with Google and so on. So that's what we'll be setting up. Now, there is a full list of them further down in the menu here under providers. And then you can scroll to get the details for each one that you want to set up. Here's GitHub. And after we scroll down just a little bit, you'll see there's a link and we need to configure this in our GitHub account. So now you'll already need a GitHub account to do this. And so if you don't have a GitHub account, I'd go ahead and suggest going to github.com and getting that free account set up and then coming back and do this. But most of us probably already have a GitHub account at this point. So let's go ahead and click this link and it should open up directly to the page we need. Of course, inside of your GitHub account. This one is mine, as you can see my little icon up here in the top right. So now that we're at the GitHub apps page, we want to click on OAuth apps and we want to set one up. You can see I previously set one up as I did some prep for this tutorial. Now I'm going to click new OAuth app here in the top right. I need to give this a name. So I'm going to call this NextAuth.js for tutorial. And then the homepage URL is going to be http://localhost:3000. So this is for our dev environment. When you would deploy your application, you would need to come back into your GitHub settings for this OAuth setting and change it to your deployed URL. And then the other URL here at the bottom, authorization callback URL, starts the same, but after that we're going to have a slash and say API/auth/callback/GitHub. And that would be the full callback URL. This is basically saying where it's going to send you after you authenticate with GitHub. Where should it send you back in your application? So now let's go ahead and click register application and we should be good to go. Now, what we want to have here is a client ID and a client secret. We haven't generated that yet. Let's first get the client ID copied. I just put my client ID in a text file for now, and you could do the same or paste it into a file in VS Code, whatever, just so you make sure you have that, or you could come back to this tab, then generate a new client secret. And you'll need to log in if you're not logged into your GitHub. Or actually, I was logged in. They just want you to confirm access. So you'll need to log in again. Okay, I logged in, and now notice I have make sure to copy your new secret client now. You won't be able to see it again. So make sure to just click the copy little icon here and copy this. And again, save it somewhere, and we're going to put it in our .env.local. So if you just want to go straight to that file, we can do that now too. So make sure you get it here, because when you come back, it will no longer be available to see the full length of this secret. You would just have to generate another one if you didn't save it. Back in our .env.local file, I'm going to call this GitHub secret. And after that, I'm going to set it equal to the value that I copied out of GitHub for the secret. And I'm also going to have GitHub _ ID. And I need to get that ID value that I saved in a text file, and then I'll paste it in here as well. So now I've got my GitHub ID and GitHub secret saved in the .env.local file. And it's worth noting that even the GitHub client ID that you have here changes for each one of those that you generate for OAuth. So this isn't the same between those. And of course, I'll be deleting this as well. Now that we have our secrets in our .env.local file, let's go back and complete our options with the providers that we need to insert. So once again, at the top of the file, we need to import each provider. So I'm going to import, then say GitHub provider. And this is going to come from next-auth/providers/GitHub. And then I'm also going to import the credentials provider, which should come from next-auth/providers/credentials. Okay, we've imported both providers we need. Now let's set those up. So I'll go ahead and create some space here in the array. And the first is the GitHub provider. Then we have a parentheses and an object inside. Now we'll have a client ID, and this refers to the value that we set up for the GitHub ID. So we want to say process.env.github_ID. Now notice TypeScript still doesn't like this, and we can mouse over and says type string undefined is not assignable to type string. So we can just use an assertion here at the end because we know we have a string in our .env.local file. So we can just say as string. Remember, an assertion is essentially telling TypeScript that you know better. Then we've got client secret. We'll set this to process.env.github_secret, and we can then once again say as string. And that's really all there is to setting up our GitHub provider. So our OAuth with GitHub is ready to go. Now let's go ahead and set up the credentials provider. It takes just a little bit more work, but this is something you're almost always going to want as far as having users be able to use a login name and a password. So here we're going to have credentials provider. And then we've got a parentheses and an object once again. For the name here, we'll just say credentials. After that, we've got a credentials property. And here, this is going to be an object. And then inside of this object, we're going to have a username set up, which is another object. So here, let's say label, and we're going to have this as username. And this will actually appear on the page. So I want username : then after that, there's going to be a type, and this is a text type. And then we're going to have a placeholder. So really, we're kind of defining our HTML input here. And the placeholder, you could put pretty much anything you want to. I'm going to say your -cool -username. So this is just a placeholder for that text field. And then after that, we're going to have another comma here. So we've got the comma for the credentials. Then we've got, well, that's actually for the username. And then we've got the comma for the credentials. And after that, we need to have an async function here that is an authorize function. And we pass in those credentials that are received. Now, this is where you would actually want to get your data from a database if you had a user database. And you typically would with credentials, or some place you're getting the information from where you've set up these users already. I'm just going to hard code in a user, and I'm just going to copy and paste this part in because it's mostly just a comment here that I wanted to note inside of the code for this tutorial to remind you this is where you would retrieve your credentials from whatever user table or other source where you were storing your user information. So here I'll hide the file tree with Control B just so we can read all of this, but I said this is where you need to retrieve your user data to verify credentials, and then reference the docs at this page where you shows how to configure the providers, because they do show an example of retrieving some user data and then comparing it. So how that would work. I'm just hard coding this user here, which is my name, Dave, and a simple password, NextAuth. But you would not want to do this. This will run on the server, but this is not probably what you'd want to recommend by hard coding users. That's not too flexible, certainly doesn't grow with your application compared to setting up something where you would retrieve users from. And now we just need an if statement. So let's say if, and we'll have our credentials that the function receives, and we'll say if there is a username. Notice I'm using optional chaining here. And if that's equal to the user.name, and remember user is what I just defined right here, then let's use the double ampersand because we also need to say credentials password, once again optional chaining, equals the user dot password. And I'm going to press Alt-Z to wrap this down so it just wraps all the way down. Oh, and I'm getting a red squiggly here because I didn't define the password up here under credentials. So that's reminding me to go back. So thank you, TypeScript. We will go back. Let's finish this if statement quickly. And then inside of the if statement, if they match, we're just going to return the user. And then we can have an else. And if they don't, we're just going to return null. So you could make this a ternary statement if you wanted to. I think the if statements may be just a little easier for everyone to read. Let's go ahead and define the password up here as well, which is of course why we had the comma there to begin with. So now we'll have our password, and this gets defined much the same way. So we'll start with our label, and the label is going to be password, and I'll put a colon there as well because this does appear on the page. Now the type of input here is a password. And then finally, we'll put a placeholder. You may not want a placeholder for your password field, but I'll go ahead and put one. And I'm going to say your awesome password. Now we should not have a red squiggly from TypeScript because we've defined both username and password on the credentials that are passed in, and so then it recognizes both properties. Let's take a quick scroll down to make sure we've closed out our object, and yes, everything looks good, so the options are now set up. Let's go back to our route file and import those options here at the top. So I'm going to say import options, and that's going to come from .options. So now we've got that, we can just pass it into our next auth here inside of the route, and the route's configured. I'm going to press Control B to show the file tree once again over here. So we're inside of the route file. And now this is configured with options that we defined in the separate file. And we could go ahead and start the application now. And what we want to do is make a GET request because it will already give us some information about our NextAuth setup. So let's go ahead and open a terminal. And I'm going to type clear first just to get everything else out of here. Then type npm run dev, which should start the application, and it won't take too long, and it will tell us it's running here at localhost 3000. It's already up and running, so we can close the terminal. Now I've got Thunder Client installed. You could make a GET request with Postman. You could actually take the URL and paste it into a browser and make a GET request that way also. So just let's look at what we've got here. I've got Thunder Client. And now I'm going to make a GET request, and I already have it set up, but here's what we want is our HTTP, not HTTPS, just HTTP in our dev environment, //localhost, port 3000, then API auth providers. So that's where we're going to make our request. Let's send that GET request, and let's see what we get back from NextAuth with our information. And it's telling us quite a bit about our setup here. So we have GitHub set up as a provider. It's type OAuth. And the sign-in URL that is generated for us automatically is found at API auth sign-in GitHub. And then here's the callback as well. Now here is the sign-in URL for credentials. API auth sign-in credentials. And then here's the callback URL. And of course, it's type credentials. So just by sending a GET request to our API auth providers, we can get this information from NextAuth. So again, just by using the default settings in NextAuth, it does a lot of the heavy lifting for us, and that's what I wanted to show today. Now I'm going to throw a few examples into the front end of our Next.js app, and then we'll review those as well. Okay, I've got the front end project up and running, and I want to show you the behavior of the project before we look at the code. Notice I'm on the home page right now and it says you shall not pass. So I am protecting this page, and what I have in this project are 3 different server components that are all protected in a different way. So I want to show you all 3 ways you can do that. I also have a client component. So first we're on the home page. We're not logged in with GitHub or our credentials, so it says you shall not pass. Now I could try to go to the server page. It's protected in a different way. So let's try that. If we go here, we instantly get the sign-in page that NextAuth creates on its own. You can see it says your cool username, your awesome password, just like we set up for the placeholders. We could click here to use OAuth to sign in with GitHub, or I could sign in here with my username and password. And of course, I would have to use the ones I hard-coded since we're not retrieving those from a user table anywhere. So that's another option. So that's how the server page here protects itself, which is different than the home page. And then I have one other server page that right now it's not protected, and it's just called extra. It's an extra page I made. However, I want to show the easiest way to apply NextAuth to your entire site, and then it will be protected. So let's go back to VS Code. Back in VS Code, there's one file I haven't created yet. So let's do that. And we want to make it inside the source directory. It needs to be at the same level as the app directory. So we're going to make it inside the source directory. And this is our middleware file, so middleware.ts. Now this runs on the edge, and there's some special things about this file if you haven't worked with Next.js middleware, but you only need to add one line to this file to protect your entire site with NextAuth. So I'm just going to paste this in because I also have a note with it. So it says without a defined matcher, which we're going to talk about in just a second. This one line applies NextAuth to the entire project. So we can save this. And now NextAuth is applied to all pages in our project. So let's go back to the browser quickly. And now I'm going to reload. And what should happen is, yes, we get the sign-in page automatically. We're not signed in anywhere. If I were to go back to the home page, just getting rid of everything else in the URL there, just go to localhost 3000. It should also want us to sign in with the GitHub page now because NextAuth is applying itself to every page. Let's go back to VS Code, and we'll also look at how we can just set this for a few select pages with a matcher. So now underneath this, I'm going to paste in a matcher. Now I'll press Alt-Z so we can read all of this, which is just a link to the reference about a matcher in the Next.js website, not the NextAuth website. But this applies NextAuth only to matching routes. So this can be a regex as well, and it can exclude. So you could look at way more details on this Next.js page. But with this matcher, I've just got an array here that is applying it to the extra route. That would be our extra page. And imagine we had a dashboard that we wanted to have authentication for example. So I just put in /dashboard as another example, although I don't have a dashboard page in this application. Now, if we go back to VS Code, or actually if we go back to the browser, we should see a difference here. So now I'm going to reload the home page once again. That is just localhost port 3000. Now we go back to our you shall not pass behavior instead of the behavior that was applied by putting the auth on the entire site with middleware. So now we have the you shall not pass here. But now if I go to the extra page, it should still be protected. Remember earlier it wasn't when we had that previous behavior with the home page. So now the middleware has applied NextAuth to our extra route because it's in that matcher. Now let's look at the code for the home page and the server page here because they are very similar, but they're both applying auth in a different way. Here's the code for our home page component. Now notice what we're doing. We're importing options that we define for NextAuth inside of that route that we have at the beginning there when we started working on the project, API/auth and the catch-all. Here's our options. Then we also need to import get server session from NextAuth.js. And then I have a user card component that I just imported so I could use it in all of the examples. And you could look at that inside of the components directory if you want to. Now, inside of this functional component, we await the get server session and we pass in the options. That gives us our session. So here I'm using kind of logic to determine what we display. I'm not doing anything else. That's just how I'm protecting the page. So if we have a session, it shows the user card. And if we don't have a session, it gives us that message that we were looking at, you shall not pass. Now, in comparison, let's look at the server route here and the page inside of it. It's very much the same, but notice I also imported redirect from Next Navigation. So here, we once again await the server session, but if we don't have a session, we just redirect, and we use this callback here inside of the path. So API/auth/signin, where our sign-in is, and then we put the callback value here, the param inside of the URL that is /server. So after we log in, it would take us right back to the page that we were wanting to go to. And other than that, it displays the user card. So we're just not using the same logic in the page. So two different ways to protect it there. If we look at our extra route, you'll see inside of the code, very, very simple here. It's not protected at all with this code. It doesn't even get the session. But because we applied the NextAuth protection through middleware, this page is protected. It's just applied in a different way. Back in the browser now, let's talk about the client component. Now, it's worth noting that I don't use any client components that need session data unless it's absolutely necessary. So that's just shipping extra code to the client when I can easily request that same data in a server component and not need to ship all of that code to the client. So for me, server components are usually the bulk of any page, and the client components are imported for what I would call islands of interactivity. So the server is usually the parent, and then I'm putting some client components where needed inside of it. So you don't have to choose server or client. Whenever possible, you just make the server component the parent and import the client component. However, what we're going to look at is a page completely made up of a client component, just as an example here, not something I would usually do. So let's click client here. And you shall see it is also protected. Let me go ahead and log in just so we can see some behavior from these pages after I'm logged in. And so I just typed in my username and password that we hard-coded inside of the code. Sign in with credentials. It says, hello, Dave, and this is a client page. If I refresh, because we're using that cookie that we described in the docs, it's still there and it works just fine. Notice it takes just a second here on the client page. It flashes just a little bit. That's a little different behavior than you'll get on the server page, because the server page is rendered and then sent, so you don't get that flash. So that's something worth noting as well. But they both work. Now we can go to the extra page also that's protected by middleware. We can go back to the home page, and instead of saying you shall not pass, it also says hello, Dave, and this is the home page. So we're clearly logged in. If we go to sign out, then it takes us to the auto-generated sign out page as well, which you can see is at API/auth/signout. You would just change this to sign in for the auto-generated sign in page. So we can sign out here. Now I'm going to go ahead and log in with GitHub, and we'll talk a little bit about what that does as well. You're going to need to authorize the use if you haven't done this. After you do this the first time, it's going to probably save that, and you won't have to do that again unless you delete all your data for that site. Notice I have an image coming in now, my image from GitHub as well. So we'll talk about that too. But let's go back to this client page and discuss how all of this is applied. And of course, now it says client page. So I'm doing the same thing on this page. If we refresh, this should still keep us logged in, and it does. Back in VS Code, I'm not showing you the client component code first. What I am showing you is the layout page that we have here at the root level, along with the root page for the home. That's because for the client to access that user data that we get from the session from NextAuth, we need to go ahead and create an auth provider, and that is a React context. So let's do that first. And then, of course, after we create it, it gets imported in here to the layout, and we wrap that around everything that we want to send that context to, which is just like working with any other React context. Okay, so I created a context directory, and inside of there, I have a file called authprovider.tsx. Notice it's a client component. We say use client. Then we import the session provider from next-auth/react. Then I went ahead and created the auth provider. Now it gets children just like the layout component does. So you can look at the layout component and see what it's receiving here is just the same as that is. And then inside of this, we just wrap the children in this session provider that we imported. Now, if we go back and look at the layout TSX, it might make a little more sense because look, this root layout receives the exact same thing as far as children goes. Then we're just importing the auth provider here and we're wrapping it around everything. Okay, now that we've covered the provider, which is only necessary for the client components that need the session, let's look inside of this client directory and look at the page because it's a little different than the server components. There's a little more work involved as well. It says use client here at the top. I put in a reminder comment that you need that auth provider to go ahead and get the session data. Then there's a use session hook that we import from next-auth/react. We're going to go ahead and import redirect as well, so we get redirected to that login or sign in page with a callback that says /client, because then we'd want to come back to this page. So you always make the callback value the page that you're on. And then inside of use session here, notice we get data and we're renaming it session. We set required to true, and then there's an unauthenticated, if I could pronounce that, unauthenticated. There we go. I need more coffee this morning. And then we redirect, of course, if we're not signed in. So that's what all of that does. And then if we are signed in, well, then we're just passing it once again to that same user card that we have right there. And note, I'm using the same user card inside of those server pages, like the home page or the server page. I don't think I put it on the extra page. That was just very simple. But I'm using it inside of this client component too. And I've been asked by some, can I use a server component inside of a client component? You wouldn't want to do that, but don't think of this component, which is more of a generic component in that regard. Just think of it as a React component that we're using wherever we need it, because this is within a client component. I don't have use server or anything at the top of this user card component. It's just a component that we can reuse just like a button. So we're not really nesting what you would think of as a server component inside of a client component. And there shouldn't be a reason to do that either. Remember what I was advising, use the server components as the parents whenever possible, and then import the clients and just use those where needed. However, in this example, this is completely a client component because that's what the whole page is. I wouldn't normally do that. But if you need to do it, of course, it is possible. Okay, now that we've looked at this code also, and we know how the entire app works, one other thing to cover, and that is just the details on showing that image or anything you would get. Say you log in with OAuth and there's something you want to display. So let's go ahead and once again look at the user card because it's displayed in all of these different examples except extra. And we'll see what I put in that user card. It's in the components directory. Here we are. So after we get the types, of course, correctly, I am using the next image up here because we could get an image from GitHub. And so we're saying hello and having a username. I also commented out the email. You could get the email from GitHub if you want to get the email. So I just wanted to leave that code in there in case you want to try it out. I am not using that. And then we get the image as well, and it's coming from GitHub. So after you set all of this up, and you can see how I'm displaying it down here in the section, I just defined the greeting above. You could have the email display. I defined the user image above, and this is what we're, of course, displaying. And here's where I changed out which page type, whether it said it was a client type or a server type or the home page or whatever. So now that we've looked at all of that, the setting that you need to remember about bringing in an image, because you could set all of this up and you could still get an error from Next.js, is when you're bringing in images from an outside source, you need to set those up in the Next.js config. And I did that here under remote patterns for the image that I would get from GitHub. This isn't so much a NextAuth thing as it's something you need to remember when you're pulling in any image from any of these other OAuth providers or anything you might be getting from them, like I am getting my image from GitHub. Back in the browser one last time, let's go to the home page, and it looks the same except it says home page. And of course, we do persist the login. If we refresh, I am really impressed with NextAuth and how easy it is to apply, especially with the default settings to your Next.js project. And if you'd like to see more, and of course, I bet I'm asked about role-based user authorization for, say, protected routes and things like that, or other topics, just let me know in the comments because it's very customizable. That makes NextAuth awesome because you can customize it kind of any way you need to use it. So just let me know in the comments, and I'm looking forward to hearing you and creating more authentication tutorials in the near future. Remember to keep striving for progress over perfection, and a little progress every day will go a very long way. Please give this video a like if it's helped you, and thank you for watching and subscribing. You're helping my channel grow. Have a great day, and let's write more code together very soon.